Adrian was the CEO of Helix Nutritional Sciences, a wellness and biotech company that loved talking about legacy, purity, and founding vision, almost as much as it loved charging obscene prices for powdered supplements in matte black packaging. The company had started as a niche health brand and grown into something much larger, part biotech startup, part luxury wellness empire, part cult of personality centered around the Voss family name. And Adrian leaned into that image hard. He constantly told the story of how he was carrying on the work of his grandfather, Dr. Elias Voss, a pioneer in hereditary metabolic research. Every investor pitch, every magazine profile, every company keynote circled back to the same mythology. He wasn't just a CEO, he was the biological heir to a scientific legacy. Helix wasn't just profitable, it was destiny. He talked like the company ran in his blood. People loved it, investors loved it, the board loved it, and employees were expected to love it too. I worked there as a senior research compliance analyst, which sounds much more impressive than it felt. My actual job was to review internal product claims, validate sourcing documents, and make sure our shiny public-facing science had enough real evidence behind it not to implode under regulatory scrutiny. In other words, I was one of the people whose job was to quietly stop the company from lying too boldly. That made me useful. It also made me inconvenient. The trouble started with a product line called GeneFit Precision, one of Adrian's favorite projects. It was marketed as a customized nutrition system built around inherited metabolic traits. Customers mailed in saliva samples, answered a giant lifestyle questionnaire, and got expensive supplement regimens allegedly tailored to their genetic profile. Publicly, the company called it revolutionary. Privately, it was a mess. The science wasn't there, not fully. There were kernels of real research, yes, but the actual marketing language went far beyond what our data could support. Some of the trade association claims were weak. Some were speculative. A few were flat-out dressed-up guesses. And the most aggressive language, the language promising near clinical precision, had no business being used at all. I flagged it. At first, I did it quietly. Internal memos, review comments, compliance notes. I asked for revisions to the copy, softer claims, stronger disclaimers, standard process, normal stuff. Then Adrian got involved, personally. He called me into his office one Tuesday morning and asked me in the calmest possible voice whether I understood the difference between scientific caution and commercial paralysis. That was his style, never openly shouting at first. He preferred polished intimidation. His office was all glass, black steel, and books he probably never read. Behind him hung a giant framed photo of Elias Voss in a lab coat, staring into the distance like he had personally invented excellence. I told Adrian the problem wasn't caution. It was that the claims as written could be misleading. He smiled, not warmly, the kind of smile people use when they've decided you're annoying. Then he said, the Voss name has been in this field longer than most regulators have been alive. I think we know how to speak about inherited health. That sentence bothered me more than it should have. Not because it was arrogant. He was arrogant all the time. But because there was something rehearsed about the way he said the Voss name. Like he was leaning on it too hard. Performing lineage instead of simply having it. I didn't know then how important that would become. Over the next few weeks, pressure built quickly. My flagged reports started disappearing from shared folders. Review chains were rerouted. My manager, Elena, who had privately agreed with most of my concerns, suddenly started acting nervous anytime GeneFit came up. Meetings happened without compliance present. Marketing drafts were approved faster than usual. Then came the first betrayal. A concern I had raised in a closed review session, specifically about unsupported claims tied to hereditary fat metabolism, showed up days later in a leadership meeting, except now it had been reframed as if I had delayed launch because I failed to understand the product strategy. That's corporate translation for, make her sound incompetent before she becomes inconvenient. Adrian never accused me directly. He didn't need to. He just created the atmosphere. I became difficult, then negative, then not aligned with company vision. You could feel the shift in how people spoke to me, the way colleagues started lowering their voices around me, the sudden delays in calendar invites, the careful politeness that means someone has already been warned about you. Then the rumor campaign started. Apparently I was struggling personally. Apparently I was having judgment issues. Apparently I had become emotional about project timelines. Classic move. If a woman raises documented concerns, don't fight the facts, soften her credibility. For a while I thought I was going to lose, and honestly, I probably would have if not for my cousin Leah and a stupid little ancestry kit. Leah and I are close, but not in the fake social media way people say that. She's the kind of family member who shows up with soup and sarcasm when your life is falling apart. A genetic counselor by profession, which is relevant, and one of the few people I trusted enough to vent to when work started turning ugly. One night, over wine and the kind of exhaustion that makes you laugh at bad ideas, I told her I'd ordered one of those consumer DNA kits months earlier and still hadn't mailed it in. She told me to do it already because at minimum I might finally settle the how Irish are we really family argument. So I did. Spit in the tube, mail it off, forget about it. A few weeks later the results came back. Distant relatives, a few surprise matches. I skimmed it, sent Leah a screenshot, joked about being less Irish than expected, and moved on. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Leah called me 2 days later and asked a question that changed everything. Do you know why your CEO's family name is showing up in your extended match network? I laughed because I thought she was kidding. At first, I didn't understand what she meant. She sent me screenshots. Several distant matches in the system with the surname Voss, or maternal lines tied to the Voss family tree. Something Leah only noticed because she is professionally incapable of seeing genetics casually. She had done what all smart relatives do when handed weird data. She started digging. The first assumption was simple coincidence. It happens. But then, she found something stranger. The family branches connected to Elias Voss's documented bloodline were genetically consistent with one another in a way that implied clear biological continuity. Adrian, however, at least based on how he was publicly positioned as Elias's direct grandson through the founder's only son, did not fit the relational pattern that should have existed. Not maybe, not vaguely, did not fit. I told her to slow down because this sounded insane. She did slow down, then she explained it more carefully. If Adrian really was who he claimed to be, specifically, the biological grandson through the line he publicly referenced, certain inherited overlaps should appear in the relative clustering data. They didn't. Instead, the pattern suggested he was either not genetically connected through that line at all, or connected in a completely different way than the company had built its mythology around. I remember sitting at my kitchen table staring at her notes while my food went cold. "Are you saying he lied about his family?" I asked. Leah, being both responsible and annoying, said, "I'm saying the public narrative and the biological probabilities appear inconsistent." I said, "So yes." She sighed, "Potentially." Now, under normal circumstances, this would be bizarre gossip and nothing more. But Helix had built a huge amount of branding, investor confidence, and even scientific authority around Adrian's bloodline. He constantly used his inherited connection to Elias Voss as proof of authenticity. In internal power struggles, he weaponized it. In media profiles, he centered it. In product branding tied to family research, he sold it. If that lineage was false, it wasn't just personal. It was corporate fraud wrapped in family mythology. I should say here that we didn't leap straight into exposure mode. We were cautious. Very cautious. Leah helped me understand what consumer DNA could and couldn't prove on its own. We cross-checked publicly available interviews, family obituaries, archived biographies, old foundation materials, anything that pinned down Adrian's claimed lineage. Then we mapped that against what the DNA relationship strongly suggested. The story got worse. Adrian didn't just imply lineage casually. He had explicitly represented himself in investor materials and company bios as the biological grandson and scientific heir to Elias Voss. Grants tied to the Voss Legacy Foundation referenced continuation through direct family line. Keynote speeches talked about inherited responsibility and the bloodline behind the breakthrough. It was everywhere. And if he wasn't actually part of that bloodline, then one of two things was true. Either he knew, or he had built his entire career on a lie he never bothered to verify because it benefited him too much. Both were catastrophic. At the time, though, I was still more focused on surviving work than bringing down a CEO. That changed when Adrian moved against me directly. A month after my compliance concerns were sidelined, HR called me into a meeting. Not to discuss my reports, not to address my documented objections, to inform me that there were concerns about my professional judgment and that I was being placed on an internal review after allegations that I had mishandled confidential materials. I felt my whole body go cold. It was false, completely. But false accusations in corporate settings don't need to be good. They just need to be useful for a few weeks. The evidence they waved around was laughably thin. Misrouted file access, approval chain confusion, copies of comments taken out of context, but it had Adrian's fingerprints all over it. This was retaliation, polished into procedure. And that's when I stopped thinking defensively. If he wanted to ruin my reputation to bury legitimate concerns, then I was done protecting his. I contacted a board member, not one of Adrian's loyalists, one of the older independent directors, Thomas Reeve, who had a reputation for being dry, cautious, and hard to impress. I requested a confidential meeting under whistleblower protections and brought everything, my original compliance reports, the approval chain discrepancies, the timeline showing my concerns were suppressed and my credibility attacked afterward, the internal retaliation, and finally, carefully, the lineage inconsistency. Reeve did not react the way I expected. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. He went very still. Then he asked me one question. "Has anyone else seen this?" I told him only my cousin, and only because she had the background to interpret the data responsibly. He asked for her credentials. I gave them. Then he told me to send nothing by email, and to expect outside counsel to contact me. That was the first moment I realized this was real. The board moved quietly at first. External counsel, a forensic accounting team, corporate governance review. Then, because lineage-based claims were entwined with company branding and foundation governance, they brought in a specialist consultant with expertise in inheritance documentation and family entity fraud. Meanwhile, at work, things got uglier. I was iced out harder than ever. Someone removed me from a recurring compliance call I had been on for 2 years. A colleague I'd trained stopped making eye contact with me in the hallway. Elena privately warned me that Adrian was trying to build a case for termination before the next quarter. He had no idea the ground was already moving beneath him. The breakthrough came from something almost embarrassingly old-fashioned. Paper. Not DNA at first. Paper. One of the external investigators pulled archived legal documents tied to the Voss Estate Foundation and found discrepancies in the way Adrian's father had been referenced decades earlier. Dates didn't align neatly. A birth registration amendment appeared where no amendment should have been needed. There were small, survivable inconsistencies individually, but together they formed the outline of a family story no one had wanted examined too closely. Then a private family record surfaced through Foundation Counsel. I was never shown the full document, but I learned enough afterward. Adrian's father, the man publicly presented as Elias Voss's biological son, was not, in fact, biologically related to Elias. He had been the child of an affair that was quietly absorbed into the family to preserve reputation. In any normal family, tragic, complicated, human. In this family and in this company, it was dynamite, because the Voss scientific empire had been handed down, branded, and sold through the authority of a bloodline that had not actually continued. And Adrian knew. That was the worst part. He knew. Investigators found old correspondence showing he had learned the truth years earlier during estate restructuring. Instead of correcting the record, he doubled down. He used the mythology more aggressively, not less. He folded it into investor narratives, leadership authority, and product legitimacy. He built his career not despite the lie, but on top of it. And while all this was unraveling, he was trying to destroy me for pointing out fake science in one of his products. The final board meeting happened on a Thursday. I know because I barely slept Wednesday night and threw up twice that morning. I wasn't supposed to be in the room for most of it, but because my retaliation complaint had triggered part of the review, I was asked to be present for the section concerning internal misconduct and whistleblower reprisal. Leah wasn't there, obviously, but her interpretive memo had been folded into the broader evidentiary package. Adrian walked in like he still thought this was manageable. Confident suit, controlled smile, that same polished energy he used whenever he expected to talk his way through danger. For the first 15 minutes, he almost did. He framed everything as an attack by disgruntled personnel. He suggested I had misinterpreted compliance standards. He implied governance concerns had spiraled from gossip. He even looked directly at me once with this expression that said, "You really thought you could do this?" Then outside counsel began the presentation. First came the retaliation timeline, my reports, the suppression, the approval chain anomalies, the internal review launched against me after I raised formal concerns. Adrian tried to brush that aside as administrative confusion. Then came the financial and governance exposure connected to lineage-based branding. Still, he kept his posture. Then the consultant put up the family tree. Not flashy, just clean lines on a white screen. Names, dates, claimed relationships, verified relationships. And then that sentence. There is no biological relationship here. Silence. Not dramatic movie silence, real silence. The kind when nobody shifts in their chair because the room has become too important to move inside. Adrian didn't explode. He did something stranger. He smiled, very slightly, and said, "Families are more complex than biology." Which in another context would have been true. But outside counsel didn't even blink. This company, she said, did not market complexity. It marketed direct inherited scientific legitimacy. Repeatedly, in investor materials, foundation governance, executive bios, and public representations, you personally approved after documentation showed you knew those claims were false. That's when his face changed. For the first time, the confidence cracked. He tried one last pivot, claimed the distinction was private, claimed functional inheritance mattered more than genetics, claimed everyone understood grandson culturally, not biologically. It was pathetic, because the room was full of documents showing the exact opposite. He had not spoken vaguely. He had spoken specifically, strategically, repeatedly. And when they confronted him with the estate correspondence proving prior knowledge, he finally stopped talking. 2 days later, Adrian Voss resigned. Officially, it was to protect the company from distraction during a governance transition. Unofficially, he was pushed out so hard, the door probably left a mark. The internal review against me was dropped immediately. HR issued one of those bloodless corporate apologies that managed to sound both formal and terrified. My compliance concerns about GeneFit were reopened, validated, and rewritten into actual policy corrections. Elena cried in my office and admitted she had been pressured to distance herself from me. Half the people who treated me like a liability suddenly remembered how much they respected my professionalism. I hated that part, honestly. Vindication is satisfying in theory. In practice, it often arrives wearing the same faces that abandoned you when it was costly to stand beside you. The biggest surprise came a month later when Thomas Reeve asked me to join a new oversight committee being created to rebuild product governance and whistleblower protections. I almost laughed. The woman Adrian tried to bury was now helping redesign the compliance structure that would outlast him. Leah still says this is the most dramatic possible use of a sale price DNA kit in corporate history. She's probably right. And every now and then, someone online still posts one of Adrian's old interviews about legacy in the blood, usually with brutal comments underneath. The company rebranded quietly within the year. The Voss family portrait wall disappeared from headquarters. GeneFit survived in a stripped-down, scientifically honest form no one would ever call sexy. As for me, I kept the original DNA results. Not because they mattered legally on their own, but because they were the first tiny crack in a system built on intimidation, mythology, and people assuming no one would ever compare the story to the facts. That's the thing about corruption dressed up as legacy. It looks unbeatable, right up until reality gets curious. And in my case, reality came in a little plastic tube I ordered on a discount and forgot about for weeks. A simple DNA test didn't just ruin my boss's career, it exposed the lie he built it on. And when the truth finally hit the table, it didn't just save my reputation. It gave me something better. Proof that some people only look powerful because everyone around them is too scared to check whether the story is real.